Hi there, and welcome to episode 2 in the second season of podcasts about The Art of the Turnaround, a book by Mike Dunlop, which is published on the 9th of September. Now, what we're doing is we're drilling down a bit more into the themes which we covered in the first season. Specifically, we're looking at mentors and mentoring. Now, the last time we spoke about your inspirational teacher, Mike, a mathematician, when you were at school in the 1960s called Dr. Martin Cundy. Today, we'll look at the second of your 3 key mentors, a brilliant man, by all accounts, called Charles Ross, or Charlie Ross, I think, as he was known. He was a pioneer, wasn't he, in computing, and he was a serial entrepreneur back in the 1950s, the 1960s. As I say, I hadn't heard of him, Mike, but I guess you wish more had.
Yeah, he was absolutely incredibly prescient in terms of the impact that computers were going to have. And looking back and going over some of the conversations that we had, it was just stunning. He saw the future as clear as day, and I was so lucky to work with him. And with Charlie, it wasn't working for him. It was definitely working with him. So even in his approach to business, he was very different. He wanted this eclectic team around him that could create things that he envisioned in his mind.
Before we dive too much into Charlie Ross and your relationship with him, I'd like to just get an idea of the backdrop, just the canvas, so we know what we're talking about here. You'd just left school, you're in your 20s, and we're talking London in the 1960s. What did you do when you left school?
Well, actually, it was a little earlier than that. I was 18 when I left school with a very undistinguished educational record. I think they called it a gentleman's C, and that was for attendance rather than any performance. I left school, and the career options I had were banking, stockbroker, or forestry. Well, I never liked camping, so that ruled out forestry. I had no idea what stockbrokers did, so I ended up being advised as the only career possible was banking. And
So many boys from private school just did go into banking, didn't they?
Yes.
In fact, Charlie Ross, his first job was in a bank.
Yes, he worked for the Queen's Bank, Coutts, and which was a very sort of distinguished, old-fashioned bank, probably still writing out your statements with a quill pen, even in the 60s. So it was a very interesting time. But I did get a job in a bank, and so I turned up in the City of London in my suit, and had probably the most mind-numbing job you could possibly imagine. It was just stunning with boredom, going through bills of exchange and letters of credit, which I didn't understand. I didn't understand why I had to add them up every day and put them in a pile. And next day there would be another pile for me to add up and put a tape with them. And it was beyond boredom. So I was very receptive to new ideas and new opportunities.
You sound totally ill-suited to that job in the bank, Mike. I can't imagine you lasted long.
I didn't. I only lasted about 9 months. And it was actually on the tube going into the city that I opened up a copy of the Daily Telegraph. And there, right in the middle, was 2 full pages of an ad for this new company called International Data Highways. And we were instructed to turn up at the Russell Hotel in Russell Square, which was a beautiful, ornate late 1800s, 1900s hotel, a very dominating position with a massive ballroom. And in that were these desks, 800 or so desks, and we were to take 4 hours of exams in the morning and then have lunch, and then 4 hours in the afternoon. And they were going to select 8 candidates to work with what became Charlie Ross.
Do you know what the job was?
No.
No idea of the job you were applying for.
Sounded interesting. It was to do with computers. There was and future technology. It was sort of it was very sort of vague. It was more sort of future technology, working with computers, mathematical skills, just something very vague and British. You don't want to give the whole game away when you're going for the job. So,
You know what I was really struck by, Mike? You named the company. What was it called again?
International Data Highways.
Now, isn't that fascinating to call something International Data Highways back in the early 60s? That sounds very prescient.
It was unbelievable. I mean, and Charlie Ross, who became my mentor, was absolutely, he could see the future unbelievably clearly.
This is a guy who, let me guess, you're in your late teens, early 20s. By my reckoning, Charlie Ross is in his early 30s. I mean, he was born in 1936. So, yeah, he'd have been in his 30s, wouldn't he?
Yeah, he seemed quite old at the time because I was 18 and he was twice as old as I was. And but he had this exuberant confidence of can do and just an endless stream of possibilities. And I think one of the things that I learned from him was what was possible, and to be able to look at things and extrapolate how technology and how computers could impact them.
Okay, let's not get ahead of ourselves. We were at the point where you sat the exam. I'm assuming you beat however many people you had to beat to get the job. Yeah.
Yes, I got the 5th position and out of 8. And so I got this wonderful letter that arrived at the place where I lived, 7 Albert Place in London. And this very formal letter arrived and said that I was to turn up at this beautiful area near Hatton Garden. I think it's Charterhouse Square, I think is something. Anyway, it's a really nice area of London. And they had built an entire classroom for us.
Wow. For the 8 of you.
For the 8 of us.
You still didn't know what the job was.
It was to do with computers and technology and the
That's
future.
all you knew.
Yes. Sounded
And
infinitely better than the bank. I mean, this was.
So I guess this was all set up by Charlie Ross. At what point were you introduced to him? Did he meet all of you when you walked into that new job?
After we'd done the exam, there was an interview with him. And I remember it was a strange interview because he put his feet up on the desk and he lay back in his chair and was just unbelievably enthusiastic and excited and just told me all the wonderful things that they were planning on doing and all the things that he was going to work on, and that we would be some of the leading computer people in the country, and he was going to make sure that we had every ounce of educational knowledge that was available for our team of 8.
What was your first impression of him, Mike? Was he laconic? Was he buzzing? Was he
cheerful,
intimidating?
Cheerful, just welcoming and cheerful and exuberant, and so un-British, you could barely recognize him as being British. I mean, he was just...
Although he was British.
He was British, very British.
Public
school and worked for Coutts, the Queen's bankers. And no, but he was very different, very outgoing.
What is interesting is I think it'd be quite useful actually to get a bit of a backstory on Charlie Ross. As I said, he was born in 1936. By all accounts, he had a very happy family background. His father... like him initially, his father was a banker. His mother, interestingly, was a suffragette, wasn't she?
Yes.
He went to school in London. What I do notice, there are quite a few touch points with you. He was very bored at school, like yourself. He was very good at maths at school, like yourself. He didn't go to university, like yourself. So in a curious way, you've got a lot in common with him.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it was... I think he saw potential. I think he saw what he'd already done, and he was doing things in the computer area or even thinking about things that no one had ever thought of before. I mean, that's what really...
a real pioneer.
Oh, total pioneer, a free thinker, and just the person he reminds me of actually is Elon Musk, just someone that just says that I'm going to build an electric car company that's going to be the biggest in the world. And by the way, in parallel, I'm also going to redo the space system and build a space company. And if I've got time, then I'll buy a media company and slot that in as well.
So you got this job with him. There's this merry band of brothers and sisters, maybe, I don't know.
There was one lady.
One lady, 7 men. And what task did he set you to? What was his big dream?
Learn everything that was available. So they bought us a small computer, a digital equipment PDP-8S, and that we bought from Digital Equipment in Maynard, Massachusetts. And we started programming on that. And we had 2 professors from Imperial College of London who worked with us for 2 full years. And so we had 2 professors for 8 students. And they just disgorged every ounce of knowledge they had about how computers work, Boolean algebra, how you translate from code, assembler code, into machine code, how that worked, how the bits got set in the computer, how circuit boards worked, just about everything that was available to be known.
But this sounds more like an apprenticeship, a high-ranking apprenticeship rather than a job, doesn't it?
Oh, yes. But we were
like you're going back to school.
Well, yeah, but we were expected to also be productive as well.
To produce what?
So Charlie bought 2 very large Sperry Univac 418s from the U.S. Navy.
Now, these are big military computers.
Yeah.
They're the size of wardrobes, aren't they?
Yes, and they were actually designed to program guided missiles, the earliest guided missiles. So these massive computers arrived in a basement in Clerkenwell Road, which was intersected by Hatton Garden with the diamond exchanges in Hatton Garden. So in this basement was this massive. There were 2 computers, so it wasn't just one. There were 2, and they had massive drums that weighed 2.5 tons, and they held a staggering amount of data, 250 megabyte of data. The computers only had 64K of 8-bit memory, so they were really small, and massive drums that took an hour to get up to speed. And then the read-write heads were lowered on top of that. And that was your first rapid random access of an I/O device. And that changed how you could think about computers and what they could do. And Charlie had this all spelled out in his mind. And we were just enthusiastically following what he'd done.
But what was his end game? What was the product that he was trying to achieve over those 2 long years?
So he felt that there was the stock exchange was archaic in the way that they calculated the value of shares at the end of the day and the value of treasury bills and a number of different aspects of the stock exchange. And he felt he could store all of them on one of the drums and then store all the bank and insurance companies' portfolios on the other drum. And he could produce a full valued portfolio overnight that could be delivered anywhere in London for all the big insurance companies and banking companies. And he could do it overnight. And that was the first project we worked on.
Did it work?
Yes. And not only that, but then he also came up with the idea that we could use the telephone lines, which were copper, and put a telex machine at the end of the line, and they could then directly communicate with the computer and build dummy portfolios and see how these portfolios would have performed if they'd bought these stocks. So this was 25, 30 years ahead of the Bloomberg machine, which made Bloomberg. But he had it all worked out. It was all right there in front of us. And our job was to make it work. And we had, I think, 30 terminals scattered around London. So we were actually in 1967 the first software as a service, because no one installed the computer, no one installed the program. They just ran it from their telex machine and keyed all the questions in, and the computer would come up with the answer and print them out.
What's really interesting with people like Charlie Ross, people who are ahead of their time, is that a lot of their peers, those around them, the establishment, just don't get what they're at. Did people get what he was onto? Did they figure out where he was at?
They were dismissive. He got it working. We had actual customers. He lobbied very hard for the government to support what we were doing. England at that stage, the computers science was actually probably 10 years ahead of anywhere else in the world. And he tried to get the Harold Wilson government, the white hot technology. He tried to get support from the government and spent a lot of time lobbying for Britain's position to lead the world in computers.
Now, this is a really interesting corner that we can turn here, Mike, because you touched on it. Back in the 1960s, those who don't remember it, Harold Wilson was the prime minister, and I think it was in 1963 he made that very famous speech where he said Britain would be forged, and I think it was, and correct me if I'm wrong, the white heat of a scientific or a technological revolution.
Yes,
now,
exactly.
The really interesting thing is that never really happened. It was all hot air, if you like, wasn't it, rather than white heat?
Yeah, and there were so many wonderful computer companies out there, one called Elliott, one called Ferranti, Marconi. I mean, there were just incredible brilliance in circuit board technology that was completely wasted. And many of those people went over to America and worked for Texas Instruments, worked for IBM, worked for Sperry Univac. But we had a hold at that particular point. So it's genuinely sad.
Yeah, the UK was ahead of the game, wasn't it? And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Harold Wilson just had this fixation about trying to get foreign computers into the UK so that we could then have the infrastructure to house them, which seems absolutely bizarre.
Yeah, he actually killed the British, what was then called ICT, International Computers and Tabulators, and insisted the government bought American computers from IBM and from Sperry Univac, and just let the British capability languish.
He must have been beyond frustrated at that.
He didn't seem that way. He was kind of on to the next thing. And one of the staggering parts was he was talking about quantum computing in 1967. We're now just getting our hands on how to make quantum computing work. And he had it in his mind that computers would be would grow and grow and grow. He was an early Moore's Law advocate. He felt this technology was not going to stay in a box. And so I think that influence around me at that age really opened up the possibilities. And that was his sort of main legacy and mentorship to me, was that he created an environment that kind of made everything possible.
I mean, a lot of mentors take their mentees, if that's the right word, to one side, and they nurture them, they feed them. Did you feel that, not that you were the special one, but did you feel mentored?
I felt I was special. I was the only employee that had a weekly meeting with him for a couple of hours, which his secretaries organized. And so it was delightful to come and visit his secretaries, who are stunningly beautiful, as one would expect from Charlie Ross. And this 2 hours was set aside, and we would just talk, and we would come up with ideas, and he would discuss it. So yes, he made.
Was that in the work environment, or did you go out and have a pint?
No,
of beer,
it was always in his office, and always with his feet on his desk, which seemed to me a little different, but he was different. But he was very welcoming, warm, And I think he liked me. He just liked the fact that, and he gave me tasks that he didn't give anybody else. He would say, Michael, we need to get this solved. These are the parameters. This is what the answer. This is what we want from the conclusion, and go away and fix it.
So he didn't socialize with you at all,
Nope.
did he? He had very
Nope.
set parameters, did he?
Yeah, very set. But he gave me enough of attention to give me self-confidence that some people say I had a little bit too much of, but he was very gracious about that.
Another thing I've just remembered that you had in common was that he also, at one point in his life, I think he worked for BEA. He went and worked in aviation and computing, and that is very much, your current role. You're in the middle of aviation and certainly in computing with your company NetInspect, and also autonomous machining. So many things you've got in common. Another thing you have in common, I think, and I may be wrong, is that frustration with the British establishment makes you turn away from it and to America. And I know he did turn to America for more of a sort of receptive audience to his ideas, and certainly for funding, didn't he?
Yes, and that was, but interest, you mentioned aviation. In those days, we had a book that was published and had every airline in the world and every timetable of where they flew and at what time. And it was called the World Airways Guide. And all the airlines fed into this central system their timetables. And this took forever to tie all these together and to check that they were correct. And you had this little book. So if you're stuck at the airport, you could go onto a computer, and so you went to your World Airways Guide, and you saw that the next flight to South Africa was in 4 hours, and you used this book religiously. He said we need to find a way of compiling that faster. So he actually designed a fully digital version of the World Airways Guide, just as a side task that we did to keep us entertained. And one of the parts of that was the printing. So one of my tasks was he had gone to America, he'd found a digital typesetter called the Harris Photon typesetter, and he bought it on spec and it was delivered. And my job was to connect it up to a completely foreign system, which was the Sperry Univac, and to work out the interface between the output of the Sperry Univac and the input on the photo typesetter, which allowed us to convert the digital array that was in the computer directly into the typesetter.
What's interesting about Charlie is that he was clearly a brilliant man, a real visionary, but I think he also quite humbly said that he's made more mistakes in his life than anyone else he knows. And I think he recognized that you can only crack forward by making lots of mistakes and learning from those mistakes. Do you have that in common with him?
I think his mistakes were not staying with things. I mean, he had brilliant ideas, but he'd be on to the next. So the mistakes that he made were just not continuing. And one of the things I have learned is you have to keep on going, and eventually things work out. And you may have to pivot, you may have to change, but he just stopped and he'd go on to the next one.
But is that necessarily a bad thing?
What, stopping and going on to the next thing?
Yeah.
Well, you never get anything completed. It's a bad thing, yes. You have to stay with it, because there's a lot of things that happen when you stay with it that don't happen in the early days. And
but he also said life's been an absolute adventure. It's been great fun.
Yeah, but it needs to be.
So he didn't regret it.
I think in some ways he did. If he was entirely honest, he saw what other people did with what he had kind of invented. And I think if he'd been a more patient man, I think he would have stuck with it, and he could have out-Bloomberged Michael Bloomberg by about 20 years if he'd stuck with it.
You say if he had stuck with it, he did so many things, as you say. Are you able to pinpoint what you think his greatest achievement was?
I think looking into the future and but not completing it. That was my sort of sad indictment of Charlie, was that he never got to enjoy the fruits of his intellectual labor. He saw other people do it, which maybe have some enjoyment factor in that. But if he'd focused, he could have been a genuine latter-day Elon Musk. He had exactly that sort of spirit and knew what was going to happen in the future and refused to have any constraints. Everything he taught me was that if there's a constraint where we can't do something, then it needs to be eliminated. You need to find the way to eliminate constraints, which I know is also, we talk about that in the book. What were obvious constraints, he overcame. And
I think you call it the elimination of constraints.
Yes, yeah.
Mm. What was the most valuable thing you think you learned from him as a mentor, Mike?
I think vision of what is possible and this sort of unreal ability to believe in the future and always be positive, always be upbeat. And he's liked surrounding himself with younger people. He always had a sort of a following, an intellectual cadre of younger people who he felt he could guide, and he certainly guided me. And he was genuine, a pivotal person. I think it's very hard to bring it down to a sort of granular level, but there were so many pieces that he added to my life in terms of looking at what is possible, that when I came to America and the land was fertile and there weren't the naysayers and there weren't the Jeremiahs, I basically took off after that. I felt anything that I could envision, I would be able to do. So I'm always grateful to him for that.
How has he shaped your life, Mike, Charlie Ross?
I think it's indirectly. I think what he did was show me a different path, a path less traveled. He also showed me that the path was extremely exciting. It was comfortable. He also comfortable, that he took risk-taking as being the norm when other people thought it was utterly frivolous and would end in tears. And he had this sort of wonderful cavalier attitude, but with substance. So it wasn't just cavalier, let's sort of try it and see. He had a cavalier attitude with knowledge. And it was that combination that just, I thought this was the most magnificent person at that stage in my life that I'd ever met. And his life just seemed wonderfully organized, and everything was exciting. And when I was asked to come to his office, there was another exciting project, or there was another crisis that I was called upon to solve. And it was, Michael, just take care of it. And I said, okay. And I called him Charlie, which was very unusual. He didn't want to be called Mr. Ross. He wanted to be called Charlie.
He sounds quite intoxicating.
Yes. And you absorbed it. And I don't think until recently that I've realized how much I absorbed from him. And I think that's a lot of the case with mentors. It's, there is a subconscious absorption from really good mentors that you don't realize what you've absorbed until you look back and you say, where did this pathway come from? And you look back on it, and it came from a particular person opened up a new pathway for you, a new thinking process. And you realize that was the why in the road in your life. And that's what made the difference. So I think with all the mentors that we're going to talk about, Dr. Kunde, and talking about Charlie Ross, and then next time, Dave Friedenberg, these were all not warm and fuzzy people. These were hard driving individuals of stunning intellect. And it was an absorption process. It wasn't the comfy, take care of how Michael is feeling. It was, Michael, this is what you need to do. Please get it done and get back to me. Okay.
That's a very important rejoinder that mentors aren't your nannies. They shape you, and it can occasionally be brutal.
Yeah. And they always require a different level of intellect than you think you have. You
have to step up to the plate.
You have to step up to the plate, and they're not warm and fuzzy. It was like we say here, it's the life insurance salesman's motto. If at first you don't succeed, that's it.
I remember him being described as a great risk taker, a serial entrepreneur, and a man of huge enthusiasm, which I think sums him up very nicely, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think, again, it's the ground was not fertile. If he'd been born in America and did what he did, we'd be reading about him as being, as I said, a latter-day Elon Musk, someone who changed the entire world and saw what was going to happen in the future and was comfortable going there. I think he was just in the wrong place. And I think the greatest gift that I've been given was transplanting to America with this intellectual guidance and vision that I think I adopted from him. He was a very easy person to adopt his philosophy.
Yes, I remember he said in an interview once, I've lived a good life, haven't I? And it's been one very long adventure. And I think he lived, probably into his late 80s, and he died just in the last few years. Sadly, you never got to meet him again, did you?
No, I didn't. I tried to write to him. I found that he had founded a group called the Real-Time
Club.
Yeah, Real-Time Club. And he was, I think, getting quite old at that stage. But I think this is a sort of in memoriam, in a way, to sort of thank him. Unfortunately, it's post-mortem, but I've tried to do and complete some of the things that he had a vision of doing.
Well, Mike, that was absolutely fascinating. Thanks so much about introducing us to a man I think few people know about, but I hope people will now go away and look up Charlie Ross and see him for the pioneer of computing that he was. Next time, we'll talk about the third of your great mentors, a man called Dave Friedenberg, who took you on a whole new journey. Thank you for listening to The Art of the Turnaround. If you love this podcast, please like and subscribe. You can follow the show on Instagram and TikTok at The Art of the Turnaround. You can follow Mike Dunlop on LinkedIn or his website, theartoftheturnaround.com. This podcast was produced by Cadence 3 Studios. I'm your host and story editor, Alex Dunlop. April Bricker is our executive producer. Burke Tobenek is our producer and editor, additional editing by Eric Scheel. The show art was designed by Todd Arbuckle. Andrew Kindred is our sound engineer, and Eric Munch is our audio mixer. The Art of the Turnaround is based on the book by Mike Dunlop.